So obviously, welcome, Edson. Hannah joined us, and she hasn't really spoken because she came in a few minutes late. So what we do, obviously, everyone, this is Edson, this is everyone. What we do is quickly go around to just have a little brief introduction to everyone, so you know who we are, what we're doing, where we're kind of at the moment. So I'll do it in the order you guys are on my screen. So Michael, do you want to go first, and then I go around?
Sure. Yeah, I'm Michael. I'm from Bristol. Grew up in the city. I just recently graduated. I classically trained as an actor, and I've started diving more into writing. I've also directed a show as well. And I just started a theatre company with Zahid, the Working Theatre. We're hoping to put up our first production pretty soon, and just been sort of doing the groundworks and trying to make the connections to make that happen. And just really passionate about creating art that's relevant and, you know, sort of moves the conversation forward, and also just delivering good opportunities to people who are, you know, creating art for the right reasons.
Nice.
Chris?
So my name is Chris. I'm from the Dominican Republic, Caribbean man. My ties to the UK are because of my mother. My mother's Irish, so I'm a half-breed, as some people like to say.
Do they still say that?
Well, yeah, sometimes.
Okay.
But yeah, I'm a trained actor as well. I lived in New York and in London for a while. So that's me.
And then we'll go Jacques, Hannah, and then Tatiana.
Hi, Edson. I'm Jacques. I'm from Los Angeles, raised in Argentina, and I've been living in New York City for the past 10 years.
Right.
I'm also an actor. I trained at the same place as Chris and Zahid, and that's where we met. And yeah, I'm currently a writer, and I'm finding that writing is such a much more rewarding experience than acting. And I love theater and acting. I'm just I'm very happy to learn about how you communicate. And I was even taking notes down and I wrote down ideological weapon, which I find very interesting. You know, this such a, you know, it's not even a tangible thing, but it's such a strong and capable weapon to make things and change things. So I'm pleased and honored for you to join us today. Thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you.
I guess I'm next. I'm Hannah. I was born and raised in London, UK, and I'm half Iranian, half Canadian. After I graduated from college, I was more on the track of like foreign correspondence. So I did a lot of work for National Geographic and CNN, only to end up in acting school, which is something I love, and it's kind of what I want to pursue for, you know, my lifetime. Just like Jack, I think I found a real sense of empowerment in writing, and especially in coming together every week and sharing our stories and the narratives that we all want to see be represented, that, you know, some have and some haven't. So it's been a cool journey to embark on with these lovely comrades.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Nice. Tatiana?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Tatiana. I was born and raised in LA. My family's Colombian. Yeah, so I finished training maybe like a year and a half, 2 years, I think, almost now, at Stella Adler in LA. And that was, I think, a big pivotal point for me, because I liked theater and acting, but I didn't really know why. And yeah, I felt like it made me kind of like focus on like, what are the things that I want to say? And now I feel like I'm into like the writing aspect, but maybe a perspective of an actor, because I feel that we have so much to say, and there are a lot of figures that have spoken up, and like, you know, in the past couple of years, 10 years maybe, But now I feel that it's like it has to be more individual, and I think everyone can. Yeah, so I'm very interested in how people say certain things and whatnot.
Amazing.
Thank you.
And I'm obviously Zahid. I trained with some of these guys, and we kind of just kind of gathered this group together so we can kind of support one another and work on stuff. And it's been an interesting sort of few weeks since lockdown. We've been doing this, and it's been interesting kind of developing ideas and sharing ideas and gaining perspective from different people. And I guess with myself, I trained as an actor as well, and then kind of got into writing and directing while at drama school. And then also a part of it was because once I came out, a lot of the stuff that's written for ethnic people, it's just super negative. And then having met people and stuff, I thought one of the ways to change it is by being there at the inception of any idea. So you can have your say. Otherwise, you're just going to get people telling you what they think of your culture, what they think of your point of view, or that kind of thing. And then also another thing that's annoyed me over time as well is being Asian. It's like a thing that we whenever we see ourselves on TV, it's for funny reasons or it's comedy a lot of the time, and we don't have any figures to kind of tell our stories. And that's kind of the aim, really. So yeah.
Mm.
And then, so I've got some questions, Edson. I'll bring my notes up now. And
yeah, absolutely.
We'll go through a few of those, and then we'll go just open it for like a Q&A, and we'll kind of go from there. So obviously, you're a doctor in history, right?
Yeah.
And you've come from that background of kind of learning about what's happened in the past and based on factual stuff. How do you translate that into a play and add the element of entertainment into that at the same time?
In some ways, I see myself more as a storyteller, and I see history as giving you the tools to kind of accurately reach into the zeitgeist of a different time. So I think one of the problems that we see in sometimes in contemporary writing, is the idea that the zeitgeist of today is the same as it was tomorrow, or yesterday, sorry. So if you imagine just how recent race is in terms of the history of human behavior, or even just how complex race shifts even during the transatlantic slave trade and colonial era, there are so many stories, and there are so many possibilities in the past that in a sense are quite liberating for us to realize that actually the current space that we occupy is quite fragile and elastic because it hasn't always been thus, and we can see how it's been created. So in a way, for me, it's not so much how that translation works, but what does it offer? What does that offer in terms of being able to say something about the zeitgeist of time, or how we've arrived at this place now? And how different that construction of then was from how we've arrived now, what's been lost and what's been gained, and to do some of that mythologizing as well. I wrote, I'm always fascinated as well by, I guess, the stories that don't often get said or aired, the less obvious stories. So, I mean, to take an example, there's a big dichotomy within Black activism around the sort of house slave versus the field slave and that sort of nonsense. And in reality, it's the person in the house was as likely to be as revolutionary as someone in the field, or as likely to feel compromised. But this is not about political allegiance. These are also about emotional ties. And when people have been immersed in an environment in which there is no alternative ideology, right? This is what they've been born with. This is what they know. Then their sense of group loyalty that we see today, like blackness or whatever, it doesn't exist. It's much more complex. So I remember writing a poem about a woman who knew that a rebellion was coming, but she was so invested with the 3 generations of the slave family that she'd raised. There's a physical attachment that she then had this power of life and death, of whether or not to kind of spill the beans. Look, there's going to be a conspiracy or not. And I guess what I was trying to reach to was the sense that our simplistic and rather sort of brutal way of articulating people in that sense of traitor and in-group and out-group, whatever, actually underneath this are complex emotional ties that we can enter. Another example, sometimes there's a pornography of suffering that comes with our histories. And, you know, there's an uncomfortable truth that people find the most macabre joy or ways of surviving in the most heinous situations. And sometimes out of, you know, whether it's charity or whether it's, again, sort of using suffering as a way in the present to kind of make a political statement, we somehow shave the edges off the humanity of the people of our past, the people whose suffering we have come out of. And so a friend of mine said, you know, oh my gosh, you know, slavery was all about rape and murder and death. And I was like, yeah, but, you know, like there were slave marriages, people, and if they weren't legally married, they held relationships. And that's the other thing, right? Because a lot of what we see in terms of matrifocal families, relationships where families torn apart, are not directly a result of the end of slavery, but they have as much to do with economic stresses upon family life, which we see in mining communities and so on. Macro stuff, which gets played out again and again. So my friend was saying this, and so I wrote this poem called How Our Love Survives. And it's actually looking at the context in which of all those sort of mitigations, all those ways in which people in oppressed situations navigate their way to a humanity, to those kind of celebratory feelings that remind us that they remained human. Because I think in some ways, if we don't enter into those stories and give them life and texture and color and that 360-ness, then in a sense, we're part of the erasure of people as being able to live being able to have the possibilities of joy and other emotions other than our use of them as sort of vehicles, political vehicles of suffering in order to create a point in the present.
Amazing. And then in terms of when you have an idea for a play, where does the idea stem from for you? Is there, where do you find what you want to say at a particular time? How do you find that? And are there stories that you're like, you want to tell now, and then do you kind of, having studied everything you studied, are there times where you're like, I need to say this now? But basically what I'm trying to say is, does the environment make you write certain things at a certain time? And where are they born from?
I think the difficulty is around, sometimes there are different opportunities. There's writing blue sky and what comes into your head, and there's a commission and there's parameters around that commission. So theatre and poetry are probably my freest, mediums. But radio in some ways is an interesting one, because I guess there is a sense of pitching a set of stories and seeing which one does a commissioning editor like. The problem I've never written something that I've hated, and I've always pitched ideas that I've wanted to write, but there are sometimes stories that are more interior to our communities, to our concerns, and perhaps and that other communities are less aware of, put it that way. And those stories tend not to get picked. Because in a sense, in the radio drama world, as I've experienced it so far, people are looking for the intersection. What is it that white audiences are interested in? What are things that they can get a handle on in your experience that they'll go, right, yes. Whereas sometimes there are a set of concerns and things going on that are really actually, when Toni Morrison said, I don't write for white people, it wasn't a hostile statement. It was saying that in order to tell these authentic stories, you just are trying to be true to the things and the concerns that you have. And that way you open up in the best way possible, the universal and the particular. So in a sense, I'm convinced that audiences in radio drama would be much more open to those interior stories, because they're human stories, right? But you know, commissioning editors feel they know their audience. And because they feel they know their audience, then obviously they'll be looking for those stories which create that kind of intersection. In saying that, I always try and be true to the world that I know, to the diversity of voices that I grew up with, and to try and bring those in. I'm not so much, I mean, to be honest, I probably have more ideas than I ever really have much time to do things with. So it's not so much a sense of, do I have to write this now? But sometimes it will be a story or be a personal concern, and that will be the germ of an idea. And then what I'll do is start thinking of the story arc, thinking of what's the most interesting angle, thinking of what's unexpected, what's the voice that hasn't been heard. So my first radio drama, for example, and sometimes, yes, one of my concerns is that in the narratives that are available in public space, that there is a lack of clarity or nuance. And sometimes drama allows me to perhaps tell a different story. So I was going to give one example, but I'll give a different one. One of my early plays that hasn't actually gone to full production, I want to revive it, was called The Book and the Bit. And I think one of the problems with the transatlantic slave trade is that it very much fits into this sort of sealed narrative of it was over there and then England ended it. And, you know, so now what we're doing is living through the reality of its legacy, that a bit like foreign intervention, you know, in Iraq and so on, it's the mess that you leave countries in means that while you can create a sealed narrative, the ripples carry on and then they return, right? So I was fascinated by the Black presence that resulted from the American Civil War and also at the end of slavery. So you've got Black people in Britain and in England trying to make a living. But I was also aware that within oppressed groups, there are also there are power dynamics. So I wanted to kind of look at Black humanity not as sort of suffering humanity without texture, but these are three different characters who find themselves trying to eke out a living by basically selling Blackness to white audiences on the streets of London. So they perform "Escape from Execrable Slavery," "See Kwashi tear off his chains," and on, and a reenactment of, you know, the suffering of Kwashi. And eventually the act, because people start to lose interest, we abolished slavery in 1834, they become bored. So they don't make as much money until Hermes, who was brought up in the household and learned to read, he comes across this idea of, without telling Kwashi, who is actually an escaped slave from the plantation, what he's up to, he puts an old school bit on his head, which is a metal helmet which presses down on his tongue, which brings him to a state of true and real terror. It triggers him back to the plantation. And of course, seeing real terror, everyone throws money at them. It's a wonderful act. And in the end, Kwashi, you know, after initially trying to kill Hermes, he says, well, actually, okay, right, I get it. But gradually what happens, it destroys him. And Hermes becomes more and more monstrous. He becomes more and more like the exploiter class. You know, Kwashi is a commodity. And he uses the relationship with the third member of the entourage, a voluntary mute character. He uses that relationship to keep Kwashi under his spell until Kwashi is completely broken and mentally collapses by the end of the play. So I wanted to kind of pick up the idea that, you know, what happens to people who are displaced? How do you survive as these legacies of empire? And this is not new. This is an historical process that we see reenacted today. The same sort of dynamics there, they come out of this kind of encounter, but also in a sense to, you know, I was very, when I finished SOAS, I studied at the School of Oriental African Studies. It gave me, I guess, I sense a much more informed understanding of those power dynamics that happened in post-colonial countries. Because the human dynamics, we talked earlier about sort of weaponizing of ideology. Why is it that post-colonial countries have played out some of the same behaviors of the former colonial masters, right? And in a sense, it's because we have to remind ourselves of the human dynamics and how they shift and change, and power shifts and changes, but nonetheless, we're still dealing with the same content of the human soul. So I wanted to insist on that as well. And in a sense, I think it's just too easy to shout at white audiences and give them the satisfaction of being told how nasty they are, you know, and how, because it is a kind of like a thrill. Why would anybody turn up to be told they're racist unless they're getting something out of it, right? So it's really like, yeah, guys, thanks, you know, come along. But this is actually, I think, for Black audiences to, you know, to interrogate that stuff, to talk about the vigilance around being both oppressed and capable of oppression, you know, yeah.
Mm. And then we had a brief conversation about it last week. How do I word this? So just touching upon what you just finished on there, like how do you get an audience to come and, because you go to see yourself in any piece of art, how do you get an audience to come and see a piece of work of yours without telling them that they're racist or whatever they might potentially take away from it? How do you kind of get them to identify with it, whilst accepting the fact that they're so far from it, if that makes sense? And where do they connect? How do you make them connect on a human level, rather than them? Because a lot of the time you see certain shows on TV or whatever, and the show kind of highlights that the people on the show are the other, and they're kind of watching the others. So how do you get them to kind of go on a journey with you? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It does. It does. I am. In some ways, I think most of my writing is concerned with the world of characters of people of color, and I rarely tackle white racism head on. It just doesn't interest me as much currently. And I think what they then do is enter into our stories as stories in their own right. But I wrote a play called Raising Camila, which was actually about exoticism. So I'm much more interested. So in a sense, because you've sometimes in danger of preaching to the converted, you know, the audiences that turn up to theatre see themselves as quite liberal and quite advanced and so on. And their understanding of race and racism then is sometimes it's something other and distant from them. So I think I'm keen to kind of prick that sense of complacency, that sense of settledness, to find ways in which people who think that they're quite nuanced in their understanding can actually discover ways in which their ways of thinking, their ways of being are still problematic. Mm-hmm. And I wrote a play called Raising Camila, which played with this idea of a young Black woman who was kind of the adopted daughter of a former Jewish soldier. And they were working on a tugboat. And then they allowed a young German artist to come on board the boat. And the girl, Camila, falls in love with the young artist. But his love for her is entirely exoticist. He has sort of brought into the idea of the noble savage and the purity of Africans and so on and so on. And she's just completely isolated in 1927 Germany and just a bit horny. So there's this horrible kind of compromise where she knows that this is icky, but it's much better than, it's something other than the life that she has with this older, grumpy father figure. And then the young artist, it turns out, is anti-Semitic and has no idea that this father figure is Jewish. And what I was exploring there was, there was this complex thing where Jews after the Second World War, after the First World War, were blamed for the defeat of Germany, the stab in the back theory. And also Germany had this position of had territories in Africa. So the situation was possible. But I think if it was negrophobia, for want of a better word, it would have been kind of obvious. And so for me, it was how do we explore white racism? How do we explore the impacts of racism in a way that's lateral enough for people to come home, and perhaps that little bit more disturbed in their thinking of themselves, perhaps a little bit more vigilant than if we tell them they're racist. And so far for me, I think that works, but I'm still yet to, but there's still stories that I want to tell and write in that regard. It's finding ways of creating credible racists. Do you know what I mean? It's credible, subtle racism, because it's just too easy to. Yeah, I mean, we were talking about the Black Lives Matter movement and so on, and just how difficult it is for people, I think, to really understand the dynamics of that, and to, in a sense, where social behavior, or in order to be part of the liberal community, you have to ascribe to and demonstrate a set of values. But if that is the basis of belonging, how do you actually get to interrogate your own values and actions? And how do you really get to look at the hardwired immersion in racism and racial thinking that happens to us all? So, I think George Floyd wasn't killed by, he wasn't killed by a police officer, he was killed by white terror, as a much bigger and more perennial force. And it's something which, if you live in a visual culture and if you see representation constantly, how do you truly escape that under that sense? And so your conscious values are one thing, but your subliminal ones can be something very different. It's that instinct level of crossing the street or being afraid or just not reading people as just people first and foremost without a script. And it's that constant sense of being known before one speaks that I think I want to interrogate more and find dramatic vehicles for that.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. And then all of us here are like from a minority background, I guess. And those are the stories that we want to tell. And those are the stories that kind of come natural to us. What challenges have you seen selling your stories to, white audiences in the UK or in America, who are the majority? What challenges have you faced, and how have you gone about it? And are there any particular tactics that you used in order to kind of voice yourself, use your voice through plays?
In some ways, I feel some of the things that I've outlined earlier is this: which stories get accepted and which ones perhaps not selected. But in some ways, I kind of feel I've always tried to take a human approach rather than an issue-based approach that I'm handling this head on, to get people to invest in the story as a complex and an unusual story. Not unusual for us, but unusual for their audience. Sometimes I think the issue is around being trusted, and being trusted with the appeal of a show or the appeal of a work. And also we know that sometimes you have to bring so much more of your capital as a member of a community to the process than just being a writer. It's being able to know your base, know your audience, and if it's a work that's being done in collaboration with a theatre that doesn't have that wealth of experience in terms of bringing audiences of color, it's kind of like I'm doing half the marketing as well, you know. And then they see the interest, you know, and it kind of starts to help to help itself. But left to its own devices, I mean, I've been sometimes challenged around language, around there is sometimes there's a little spectrum of language and how far you, and it's maybe something one internalizes, how far you introduce audiences to the richness and speed of, for example, some forms of Caribbean dialogue, and whether you think, well, actually, yeah, there's a compromise here in order to get the audiences in. It's not really a major challenge for me, but I would say that the key thing is to trust the authenticity of your story, trust the things that you want to say, to avoid cliche, and always look for nuance and plurality. I think it's just too easy to serve up to quite lazy white audiences what they think they want to hear, what they think your concerns are. You know, it's interesting, you know, some communities, they think, oh, it's all about arranged marriage, or it's always about, you know, maybe everyone's worried about the kids becoming terrorists or something. Maybe it's completely other stuff. And it's the other stuff, it's that interior life, which I think we have to focus on and push. Because in a sense, that opens up a much broader swathe of storytelling. And it opens up wider audiences to kind of understand who we are. But most importantly, it helps our communities to kind of see themselves. Because that's the other problem, is that if that is the main storytelling that's available, then that's how people begin to self-refer. I mean, my issue with, for example, gangster movies and so on is just that what I love about Spike Lee's Crooklyn, to put it another way, is that you've got a working class Black community. And it's about the struggles of being working class. Now, it could have been like dope dealers and hustlers and so on. It's hard enough to be working class in a deprived area. And this is the struggles, right? And I think that's what humanizing someone is, and not running to the kind of cliche. But if there is an urban story, and I have used that term in quotes, you know, one of the things that my first radio play was called The Armor of Emmanuel, and it was about a young man who was based on a true incident, a young person who was murdered, and his mother had no idea why and what had happened. And he'd basically he was quite deep in criminal underworld stuff, and was killed by one of his associates. But I wasn't interested in him because I think, yeah, bullet boy, da, da, da. I was interested in the mother and the denial. What happens in terms of how do you not know, or do you not want to know? What is it about complicity? And what is it about the stories that we tell ourselves and not? I suppose in some ways, my main interest with characters is the space that we tend to mostly occupy, I guess, somewhere between denial, delusion, and cowardice, and sometimes action. I'm not really interested in great heroes. So for me, it was kind of trying to understand, and again, this is based on a true story, how this mother had no idea what she did, what she chose not to see, and what she chose to see in that dynamic with her son. So it's strange, isn't it? Because it's not that we're looking for creating the unusual. We're just trying to be truer to our experiences, to the plurality of stories that are available, and the ways in which just the most recurring and normative one, yeah, again, what does that mean? But stories of love and wants, they all come with a different lens when viewed through our experience. And in a sense, being true to those in that different lens and that manifestation adds something. But again, most of all, it adds something to our ability to see ourselves in a different way. There's so much ways in which communities internalize narratives of what they think they are through their cultural production, whether that cultural production is created by people who are within a community, or whether it's projected on. And so I always feel like, look, how do we expand that understanding? Because I live in a world in which, you know, it feels like it's not problematic, but it's quite a plural identity, right? You know, to have, to move between different class bubbles and different parts of the city, to be involved with LGBT groups, and at the same time, hardcore, old school homophobes, and so on and so on. And many will swear blind that they are the authentic representation of Blackness, right? And what you see is the kind of broader canvas in which they occupy and sometimes overlap. And that is the plurality and richness of our experience, you know.
Sorry, I put myself in mute.
Yeah.
I think that's pretty much all the kind of intro questions done. So what we'll do is we'll just open it up, and I think that's enough for me talking, and then I'll pass it over to these guys. Who has questions? Mike, do you want to go first?
Mike?
Me?
Yeah. I actually just want to piggyback off some of the points you just made, and ask about, because I hear you very much on that, having to, you know, adjust yourself depending on who you're speaking to, you know, and sort of wear a different mask in different rooms depending on, you know, depending on what the aim is. And I guess my question is how much do you find yourself adapting depending on, you know, if you're speaking to someone who, say, for example, has interest in your piece? Because I love, you know, what you say as the writer, you take your ideas and what you want to say, and then you sort of humanize them in your characters, and that's how you sort of really connect to all audiences. But then when you are speaking with someone, for say, for example, they just want to know that they're going to sell seats, versus someone who actually has a more political agenda behind it, and they're interested from that view. Are you sort of balancing between the two, or are there risks in doing that eventually, when everyone comes under one roof and communicates, you're two different people to two different people? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah and no. I mean, I think, so we are, I guess, competent social navigators, sometimes more than competent, you know, super brilliant social navigators, because we occupy really different worlds. So if someone wants to know whether they have bums on seats, you talk their language, yeah. In a sense, the integrity to the story means that using different kinds of language, it means that actually, if that's their bottom line, but it shouldn't really impact upon the integrity of the show. But am I interested in, does the show sell? Yeah, because I guess that's one of the problems with, this is the thing where I've found that I almost don't get treated as a full adult, right? And so I want to know, what was the box office? Oh, well, you know, don't worry about that. So no, I need to know what the box office was, because you guys will not book us again if you haven't made any money. So how's it going? Are the tickets selling? Do we need to use our networks, whatever, to make sure that people are going to come along? How can I also find, so the other thing is, you know, working in Bristol, for example, I did a promenade performance where we rewrote and adapted the speeches of Frederick Douglass, the American abolitionist. But it was also a chance to connect up parts of the city that had never connected up before. So people have a diversity agenda, but they have no idea how to do it, you know, where people are at. And so what I did was also draw upon people to participate and take part in the promenade performance that I knew would bring audience with them, that I knew that would be seen as trustworthy voices to that others would follow, that this would be a good experience. And if they knew it's a good experience, then they'll come along. Yeah, I feel we talk a different language in order to pitch stuff to different communities. But the key thing is to remain true to what the experience and what the voices are that we want to depict. I mean, I suppose for me, because I live in a plural, I'm really interested in language because I grew up in a working class, very multicultural community. And it feels almost dishonest to myself not to reflect those white working class, those Asian voices that grew, those West Indian voices. And then now I occupy these middle class spaces, and I loved Keats and Shakespeare. So, you know, I think for me, there is that playfulness in language. I try and find ways of bringing some of that in each time, but not in order to sell something to someone or to appease a section of the audience. It's just that this is Britain and this is us. You know, we've kind of gone to university, we studied. These are the different ranges that we have. So if I'm in a position to create a world, well, that really is the authentic world in which I occupy. I'll have a look at the chat.
Amazing, cool. And then I think Chris, you had a...
Yeah, a lot of things you've said are very interesting, and I agree with most of it. I'm just curious, why like you said an example about the Jamaican dialect or scene maybe in a play or a movie, that you don't want to maybe put too much of an ethnic feel to it because it might scare away white audiences. But why would they scare like not scare away, but sort of keeping them in mind? So because I don't know, you know,
so not scare away, and no, you're quite right.
Because you're meant to be a bridge between the cultures, I guess. You as a Black British person, you're a bridge between those two cultures, as Zahid would be between Pakistan and England. But I don't feel like do you watch different movies than Zahid does? And then does Zahid watch different movies than a white British does? I'm curious, because in the Dominican Republic, it's not really that way. But if I think about me trying to portray an American or somebody from a more imperialist country, let's say, maybe I would have to keep in mind to not maybe offend them in a way. But I think if you don't come out as preachy, you won't offend them, and maybe they'll. I don't know.
So I didn't mean so much in sentiment. It's more a question around language. So if we take, for example, Caribbean, I don't think every island has its Creoles. So sometimes there is a real richness and rawness and fullness to one spectrum of Caribbean speech. And then there are mediations of that until there is more like received British pronunciation. So just in terms of how people speak, and it's interesting, some of our well-known British poets, quite well-known Black British poets, I still feel that that's mediated speech, because I know how my dad speaks, and I think spoke, he's passed away, but I know how people sound like when they're straight from the kind of market type, and when they're really full on cussing and rassing and clarting and blah blah. And you think, well, it's so far on that spectrum that do you occupy something which is a little few degrees less than that, so that it holds more of the audience. Bear in mind also, there is a Black British audience now, which is not of that earlier generation, where some of that kind of 1950s, 60s speed of dialect and idiom has been lost. But to be honest, the last play I did at Bristol Old Vic, Currying and Fish Fingers, because it was comedic and I really just wanted to recreate this very much his African diasporic worldview. It was just very West Indian in idiom and delivery and so on. There wasn't really much compromise at all in the audience, but it's a fascinating thing because I'm sorry, I'm just saying. I remember watching, the Barbershop Chronicles, and I think in some ways what I found fascinating there, they used a variety of African Creoles in these different spaces. But I think the British ear has probably had more time to be exposed to West Indian, Caribbean Creoles than they have to the African ones. And just through the amount of time that I've spent in London, I'm like, yeah, this is all cool. I get it. I get the idioms. I get what people are saying. Da, da, da. But I saw more white people looking around, you know, sort of, they're laughing, and you're like, you don't really know why you're laughing, do you? Just, kind of, the punchline is following everyone else laughing, but so there is something interesting there.
Do you think the viewer would lose interest if you make it too sort of Creole? I guess if making it, you know, the Jamaican example, do you think the viewer would lose interest or just be like, this again, you know?
Well, I think there's something to be said for maybe taking the Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart approach, where that which isn't translatable, you shouldn't attempt to translate. If there are things, and also there are ways of visually explaining something with theatre, which means that you can be true to the idiom and way of speaking without, in a sense, compromising it. But at the same time, I think, you know, there's something to be considered, but I think in honesty, you've got to be true to yourself and say, look, I need these characters to speak like this, and this play needs to sound like that. And the audience just have to work. And I think that's valid as well. And, you know, it's something which I'm feeling through. And as I say, the last play was probably the most Caribbean play. But I mean, I remember speaking to a black writer friend of mine, and she came and she said to me, that was the blackest play I've ever seen in the Old Vic. It's like, wow.
But
sorry.
Just to finish up, I found really interesting what you said about, you know, some movies can, like, you can relate to a movie that comes from oppression if you come from that sort of history. And I was just thinking about Scarface, you know, the movie Scarface.
Yeah.
So many different minorities. I remember when I moved to France, all the Algerians and Moroccans, they loved Scarface because it really resonated with them. Yeah. And you know, the director was a white guy, the main actor was a white guy, but then still us Latinos, we relate to that, of course, because it's a very real story about the Cubans going to Miami and all that. But I think that's a perfect example that you don't have to be afraid to offend other groups if you're well intentioned, and if it's something that's real that you actually experience, you know.
Yeah, and I think so. Just to say again, I think it wasn't so much about offending that was interesting to me. It was more around how much work does an audience do. At what point if you're doing so much work to understand what's being said, then you can disengage. But again, I think when you set up a world, then it's about reiterating stuff. You frame the world in such a way that people kind of get what you're saying. If they didn't get that phrase the first time, it's picked up again. It's like, oh, that's what they mean, da, 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 da. So there's all those techniques that we use so that we can establish our world and just get on with it. But also, most of all, that we can do that authentically. But totally, I just don't get this idea that people will not be able to grasp our stories, the human stories. People see the translatability, because we're doing it all the time. Like the Harder They Come was inspired by Westerns, right? It was.
Let me ask you just one last question.
Can I just first pick up Hannah and then come back to you? Is that all right?
Yeah, that's okay.
Sorry, because I know that she's been, and I don't know how much time we have.
I think, wasn't it Jack before me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So who goes first?
Oh, sorry, Jack.
Okay.
You can go ahead, Anna. It's
Okay.
All right. Thank you. So I guess my question, if I'm able to verbalize it correctly, was on hyphenation. How you were talking about detaching ourselves from, you know, I guess our cultural oppressors. So I guess my question is about how do we do that? Like I'm you know, from my perspective, I'm half white, half Middle Eastern, so I grew up with that kind of constant, you know, turmoil within, of never being able to separate, you know, the half of me from the other, and almost having to prove to and justify myself to myself, being part of these two worlds constantly. And I haven't asked the question yet. Sorry. I'm trying. I guess like I guess it's like I don't see it as possible us being able to tell our stories and also have them make their mark if we are alienating our white cultural audiences at the same time, because I can't deny the fact that the very militarization and securitization of my, you know, my Iranian identity was very much activated and sustained by my white identity. So for there to be reconciliation, I think, between these worlds, be it between Asia and Europe, between Africa and America, or Africa and Europe, like I see there as everyone needing to be involved, as opposed to just the you know, just the community of that's been oppressed or marginalized.
Yeah, no, what I, just to clarify, I guess so what we're trying to do, I think, is, you know, sometimes these dynamics of power in the world, I mean, in a sense, do they belong in an emotional world? How do we create an emotional space of understanding? Because in a sense, ultimately, that's what people live with. So, and that's what people take away. So how does a relationship between 2 or 3 characters tell you everything there is about the tension between sitting in those cracks and spaces, as opposed to writing an essay or a thesis? And in a sense, rather than endeavor to write the essay and the thesis of reconciliation, you talk about relationship. You try and create the integrity of the story. So if, in a sense, your lived experience does more for talking about that complexity, then that's the story, in a sense, which will inform people much more than, in a sense, trying to kind of take on what, in a sense, is this kind of abstract real space, or one, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
But it isn't about the either or. So, in a sense, of the interesting thing about The Color Purple is that the absence of whiteness tells you so much about whiteness and power, because in the world in which the characters occupy, whiteness does come in terms of the relationship with the character who's played by Oprah Winfrey in the film, Harpo's wife, whose name I've forgotten. But so much of that poor sharecropper world, so much of that dynamic owes to that intersection with whiteness and white power. And people will understand the broader context. But what you're kind of offering them is an insight as to, this is what your power structure does to people underneath it. And you're able to enter into that in an honest way by not constantly trying to speak directly to them. Because when you're speaking directly to them, then they become the made audience of address. Whereas in a sense, perhaps sometimes your focus is one's own community, to look at this is what's happening to us through this dynamic. And that's just one way of approach. Sometimes it's appropriate to speak directly to, but I think something can get lost in that, around how we depict ourselves as more than just, in a sense, the victims of their power. And just to use the color purple as another example, that then gives you an opportunity to look at other kinds of power and power dynamics. Because of course, you know, patriarchy in that film was so important. And for me, you know, looking at our humanity also gives us a chance to look at those things within our humanity. To use Black Lives Matter as a contemporary example, we're talking about decolonizing movements, then theatre has a role around how do we talk about sexism in the Black Panther movement? How do we talk about transphobia in Black activist movements? Because, and you know, there is the obvious level at which, you know, don't do this, don't do that. But of course, what we have is a toolkit to try and get people to experience the contradictions and dissonance in their behavior in those interior spaces of discussion that could be created by the world that we type out or write out.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Thank you. I was trying to...
You're going to give me 10 points.
Get 10 out of 10.
Okay. All right.
Thank God it's recorded, so I get to listen back to it.
Mm. I do say again, the key thing, just to reflect on something you said, is the plurality of our experiences. And the plurality of our experiences today is people of mixed raceness, mixed race friends who children are going to be mixed again. And for some, what that means in terms of, you know, permission to call themselves Black or a person of African heritage. Someone who's brought up in a rural environment where they're the only person of color, someone who's brought up as a white person in a Black family, sorry, a Black person in a white family and so on. But these are all our experiences. And in a sense, what I'm seeing recently in terms of drama, both on stage and in theatre, is sometimes a movement away from these kind of monolithic depictions of our experience. I still think we're touching the tip of the iceberg to talk about its complexity. So in a sense, I think we learn a lot about, as much about what we are, who we are, by exploring these more pluralistic and these things, these experiences of what we are that don't occupy the kind of mainstream of the spaces that people expect us to talk about.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, go for it, Jack.
Yeah, and actually, I think what you're just saying goes into my question nicely. With all that, do you think that the entertainment industry is steering towards voices of outsiders, like you mentioned earlier, that piques your interest?
Yes, and in some ways I think some forms have to catch up a bit, but I've got to be honest, as someone who loves the BBC, I find myself watching Netflix all the time. Because I guess they're kind of maybe smart capitalists in the sense that they recognize that the audiences and markets out there of people of color don't want cliches, and that there is more room for people to tell different stories. I'm not sure how long that will last, but at the moment there seems to be a bit more flex. And it's, you know, The Wire was a revelation in terms of quality roles for Black actors, you know, which would be once in a lifetime. And you'd, you know, be working with actors and they'd be just like, man, I'm playing a mugger again next week and that stuff. And then you get to play complex characters over, you know, over a whole year. And you think like, wow, fucking brilliant, you know, great for the writers, great for the actors. To just have that sense, being able to bring all your tools to bear, you know, and explore character with depth. I guess Michelle Cole's I Will Destroy You Now was such a revelation. I'm watching that at the moment as a refresher as to what is possible in terms of depicting, you know, Black life and also African Black British life. Zahid, you might correct me, but I still feel there's a way to go with the complexity of Asian community life in Britain on screen, especially BBC. I just kind of think, really? You know, just from my experience of the people I know, I just think, you know, you can really, the iceberg has barely been touched yet. There is, so yes, there are promising signs, but the industries and platforms are not moving universally. Some are still in the dinosaur age, and some are kind of catching up. But I think, again, where money leads and people get to start to see that, oh, actually, there are Black audiences for romance and so on, then we might start to see a changing tide. But it's also up to us as well, if we feel that those spaces are there, to have these kind of nuanced stories available. And, you know, I love a good old action rompy thing as well, but, you know, my concern is just like, as long as it's three-dimensional. That's why I love Heat. You know, I thought Heat was a great action film with character, you know, with characters 3/6 Shakespearean in its kind of complexity. And I'm like, there's no reason for an action film to be shit, you know. You know, just so, yeah, because if we're always interested in the interior life of people, then Bullet Boy, whatever else these dramas are, should kind of help us to understand what's the environment, what's the forces, personal and environmental, that create the situation, create people as they are. Because otherwise they just arrive as, you know, monsters and so on. And that just kind of reinforces the worst kind of stereotyping anyway.
Right.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much.
Cheers.
And I think, Michael, you had a question, didn't you?
I did, but I am aware on time. I don't know how long we have you, Edson, and I'm also aware that I'm one of the lucky ones that might come across you in Bristol. I wanted to sort of pick apart Anansi a little bit.
Yeah, sure.
But I did want to say, like, one of the things I loved about that play was that I felt like I was being fed into a whole bunch of stereotypes that then just sort of got altered, you know, on their heads a little bit. I love that Anansi, throughout the whole play, I was just expecting him to do something that was going to be shady and sort of, you know, and like a backstab to someone, and then he came out with full integrity, but just seemed to have a sort of almost misguided nature, you know, that he sort of fell into the wrong decisions at times, but you could then see by the end he was going through this passion, and so I guess quick question was that your intention? Was your intention to battle those stereotypes, or was that just something a birth out of a sort of another route that you went down?
Yes, it was. And so in a sense they were kind of broad brush characters, but I guess I'm always kind of concerned with what drives people. And there was something about the character of Anansi, for me, speaks of the ragamuffin hustler who has to find his way to survive, who hasn't got resource, but has an innate goodness to him. And in a sense, I suppose I was sort of thinking of those characters that I knew and people that I'd met who I think were made choices in order to survive that they wouldn't otherwise have made if the situations, if their environment, if their privileges had been different. And so in a sense, Anansi had to kind of discover his moral line in that scene where you've got the drunken, distressed character. And that really establishes that actually this is someone with integrity and heart. Because otherwise, in a sense, what is it? You know, why should we care for the character? So I think, yeah, definitely I wanted to kind of introduce people into a particular world, but to really talk about some of those dynamics that we see played out in the strange, schizophrenic, conservative, and yet ribald world of the Caribbean sometimes. You know, the sort of expectations of Takuma, who plays Anansi's wife, and then the sort of the poverty that she encounters. And this is very much within the sort of storytelling of the Nancy position folklore body. But I wanted to try and do something different with that, to talk about real-time experiences and fears, you know. The class dimensions within it too, how people try and protect how people fight to hold on to dignity, this sense of this rare commodity that is so vulnerable and it can be sort of taken away. So her expectations around being able to be made respectable and so on. But in the end, what it sort of reinforces is a sense that their dignity really comes from something more existential and is not through the trappings of wealth and so on and so on.
Yeah, and I thought she had a great character because she was so strong, but also, you know, you weren't afraid to go there with some of the other, you know, sort of like the provocative nature of Jotel, sort of bringing her over and her curious into this world and not knowing what to do. I really felt like we got to ride that situation with her, and overall went through a universal story, you know.
Yeah.
And I really appreciated that when I came out. I was with a group of friends. We all talked about like how nice it was to see so much of a different culture in the Bristol Old Vic because of just, you know, plays that typically go up there. But I was saying at the time, what I really appreciated is that when you look at any one of those characters, what they were going through just changed, you know, consistently changed, and they sort of each had their own lives. And I think that's one of the really important things for me when watching anything is the characters flushed out full life, that they don't just represent that one strand, that they show that they have a lot more. I really love that about that play.
Yeah. So I wanted each character to have a kind of an arc and a journey of their own, because otherwise they're just sort of occupying space for the sake of someone else. But also the universal story theme was part of, again, sort of emphasizing to the Old Vic and to audiences that our stories, our tales are, you can engage with them. At the core of them is basic universal tropes of stories and so on. You can engage with them, and you just have to do a bit of work to kind of listen, but it's all there. And added to that, I really wanted to talk about some of those aspects of Caribbean life that we often don't see represented. That there's a strange thing of looking at the Caribbean either through rose-tinted glasses, like, or seeing it as all gunshot and whatever else. And I just kind of wanted to use that play to look at something of that sort of more fluid richness as well. But I was going to say that the other thing was that it was the second time that I had deliberately gone ahead and said, rather than just have like a comic moment in a play, that I wanted the play to be comedic all the way through. And I remember sort of thinking like, oh, that's really what you should be doing, you know. My producer and great friend, she said, look, I'm sick and tired of seeing slavery plays and stuff. And I really I really feel it's important to kind of reflect on the transatlantic slave trade and so on and so on. But during the run, something of what she said really stuck with me, and that Black audiences of color need joy. People need joy, you know, and it's not the joy that comes from the romanticized worlds that we don't really inhabit, but something that looks familiar, that's something that feels contemporary, but is also joyful. And you think, well, actually, yeah, because, you know, there are so many constructions of us that are painful, and sometimes comedy that's lazy, that doesn't really depict where we are in a contemporary sense. So how do you create joy that audiences will want to come back and see and recognize themselves, and helps them as much a tool of resistance as, say, something which is, you know, deep, solemn, and insightful?
Yeah, and I thought you got that perfect, because it had all the entertainment it needed for a great show, and then you come away and you continue to think about things as you're going through, you know, the stuff in your own life. And I thought you really, you know, got that balance perfect. So
thank you.
Yeah, great show.
Amazing. Does anyone else have anything at all? No? I had a question. So you've written a play. Now, what challenges have you faced in terms of kind of getting it up onto stage, and how do you kind of go about it? Well, this is more of a business question, I guess, rather than the art of playwriting.
I guess in some ways my route isn't typical, in the sense that I worked with Theatre West initially, and then I've applied for commissions and been commissioned by Bristol Old Vic, built quite a relationship with them, as well as a few other theatres in Bristol. My concern with some of the other theatres in Bristol that are taking work is just what they can do for creators of colour, in terms of really understanding what you need, where the audiences are, how you can fulfill that business case. And again, I think it just means that one has to be so much more involved in in those processes than you might be if you had a theatre that you're working with that kind of understood how to market and how to bring audiences along. You are doing so much of that extra work as well. So it's, again, I guess it's what kind of leverage, what kind of team you can assemble that frees you up to make the work, but also really helps you to pull on the networks that mean people will come and see the show and will make noise about it. And also, I think that's the other thing for artists of color who are looking to tell interesting stories, is what's the critical framework in which that show sits? Mm-hmm. Who's reviewing it? Who's talking about it? And do they know what the hell's going on stage? And, you know, I've had work, I say poorly reviewed wouldn't even touch it. It's just they didn't understand it. They didn't really understand what was being addressed, what was being talked to. And thankfully, it's not really hurt very much, except perhaps white audiences. So I'm thinking, well, I might skip this one. But again, there's the kind of laziness that comes from, it's not what I expected from a black playwright. So I'm not really going to think about what's actually happening, as opposed to what I would have liked to have seen, that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. Yeah, not sure if that helps much.
Yeah, no, that's great. And then another, we kind of touched upon it earlier. We've got an issue with people from minority backgrounds going to the theatre, first of all, because they don't see themselves represented. And then we try to create work in order to kind of change that. So what needs to come first? Do we need to start going to the theatre more as a community, and then they will start to realise we need to start representing these people? Or do the theatres need to take the first step in the sense that they start putting on stuff that these communities can relate to? And how have you seen that kind of progress over time? Or has it even progressed at all?
I think it's a theatre by theatre journey. So one of the problems with work coming to the city, for some theatres in Bristol, is that the audiences are risk averse and the theatres don't know where the audiences are. So you have a perfect storm of disaster. So you'll have great plays and only a handful of people will be, and not mentioning any names, will be in the audience for whom that play could have had great appeal. The theatre might be at the other side of town, but more importantly, you know, I take an interest in who's distributing my market, any print stuff. Where are you putting it? You know, what's the point of putting it there? Because none of our audiences go there. You know, barbershops, hair shops, places where the concentration of people are at, what sort of networks and groups. And so in a sense, it's kind of like working with those those teams to do it, but the consistency of offer is the key thing. So you can build up an audience with one show, but if then nothing follows it for the next season, then it's like you're doing that work all over again. So to take a couple of other theatres as an example, they've been consistent in their offer, but they've also learnt and also used their, built up their databases so that the word flies out and you're doing less, and people return. But there's a consistency of offer so that gradually people start to come. However, I'd say that there's a real issue of complacency, especially around white theatres, and to an extent, some of us who are more comfortable with accessing certain cultural spaces. So I would say that we've touched the tip of the iceberg of potential Black audiences and audiences of colour in Bristol. And some theatres will think they're doing really well. But I would say you're doing really well with the usual suspects and you've kind of gathered a few more who've come through the door to come into theatre. But there's a much broader audience who still feel that the city centre is another country. And that requires, again, what sort of, I'd say that, look, there are different influences for different people. And I'm not the influencer for all people of colour and all people of African heritage in Bristol. But can I bung my friend a ticket and tell him to come along and see the show and tell his mates? That would make sense to me. Because again, if you got, the painful thing is when you know that the audiences will love the work and you know it speaks to their experience, but it's just encouraging them to do something which they wouldn't normally do because it's outside their experience zone. And then get people to talk about it, get people to talk it up, record it, use all the social media that's possible, where, you've got Vox Pops and talking heads saying, yeah, I love the show, come along and see it. And it's not the usual suspects in the interviewing because they'll be like, yeah, well, it would be Edson, innit? Yeah. So it's a bit of both, but I think if the theatres are really serious, then they have to think about building relationships, and you can't build a relationship overnight, and nor can you expect to sustain a relationship if you've just gone on one date. And neither should you expect the theatre company to do all that work. But let's say you do some of the lifting, we do some of the lifting at the beginning, and if they're serious, they will start to build up their own databases, build up that offer. And, in a sense, what I find annoying about the whole diversity offer is, of course, it isn't a favor for us. It's not a favor to us. We are the demographic of the country is changing. Demographic of all these former colonial countries is changing. So that the offer needs to speak intimately to more people of color, because they're just going to literally be more of us with capital to spend who want to go to the theatre. We won't go if we don't see stuff we like. We'll stay in and watch Netflix instead. So yeah. And I think maybe that's something we need to push as well, that look, this is a two-way need here. This is mutual, and help us to develop in our careers, help us to have the regularity of creating work so that our work improves and builds and builds. And you will also get these audiences that you need, but also you need to understand them and what they want as well. I think, a little fantasy for me is that people will feel so comfortable going to the theatre that they'll come and see work that is outside, not necessarily addressing their subjectivity. Like, oh, I'll go and see an all-Russian version of Chekhov, that kind of stuff. Because then they just start to think that that's a normative as well. Whereas we know that the first thing to get them through the door as much as possible is seeing their as very much the universal, not in particular, but in themselves, through people who look like them, like us.
We need to just start our own theatre company. That's what we need to do, and a building as well.
Yeah.
And just do our own thing.
Yeah.
That'd be a lot easier.
Well, it's you know, I was I think the Arts Council have moved away from this idea of funding Black arts assets, you know, buildings and so on. And I always felt that that was a mistake, because actually one of the biggest ways for people to participate in, again, in massive quotes, the mainstream, is if they feel that there is a recommended and trusted partner that has done the introduction. And so having Black theatres and spaces which are led by, owned by, managed by people of colour means that then people get into that kind of regularity of theatre going. They get to see different kinds of work. You get to also play different kinds of work to different audiences, something more pop, something more, perhaps more niche or whatever. And then also, if you're the recommended partner who has built up that audience, and you say, hey, look, you know, there's a theatre across town, got some great work on, then I think people are more likely to go, especially if they go in numbers. Yeah, we'll see.
Cool. Does anyone have any other questions before we wrap up? No.
Okay, I'm gonna eat again.
Thank you so much, Edson.
Sorry?
Thank you so much. Oh, sorry.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was great. And
Thanks, Ed.
Thanks.
All
Well, you've got my details, or Zahid, feel free to pass them on. Best of luck, everyone. All right.
Yeah, thank you, Edson, for doing this. One question we always ask guests right at the end is it okay for us to send you stuff to read?
Has any of your guests ever said no?
No.
Not yet.
Not yet.
Yeah, well, I don't want to be the first. Yeah, that's cool.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Edson.
Okay.
Yeah, cool. Do you guys want to hold on for a second? Then, yeah. Thank you very much, Edson. And yeah, I'll speak to you soon.
Sure. Okay. Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.